Today we're talking about the race to space and science exploration from 1957 to the present day. As Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, the Earth is a cradle of mankind and one cannot remain in the cradle forever. And so people have had their eyes on space for quite some time. Well, the Russians were the first to make it into space. They launched Sputnik in 1957. This is the first man-made satellite that was going to orbit the world, and people were really surprised about it because Russia kept it very much hush-hush, under wraps, don't tell anybody kind of thing. And so when they actually did it, everybody was like, wow, this is just wild. What are they doing that for? Why do they have that up there? The 1950s were a time when the United States and Russia were in the middle of a Cold War. Very tense between the two countries, very worried that one of them was going to launch nuclear missiles, and it was a very unstable time. And so when this happened and Russia beat us into space, our government started to get pretty worried. It was just 2 months later that Russia launched a second satellite, and they sent a dog into space, and the dog lived through the process. And so, again, they beat us into space. They were a long ways ahead of us technology-wise, and it was making our government very nervous. So we did our first launch into space on January 31st of 1958. We launched a satellite called Explorer 1, and it was launched for scientific purposes. We discovered some really cool things while we were out there with this satellite. We don't have people on it, remember, this is just technology. But we found the radiation belts, the Van Allen radiation belts. And following Explorer 1, we had several unsuccessful launches. We were still figuring out how all of this worked. Well, the Cold War, as I mentioned, had this extreme tension going on between the two major powers of the time. It was the United States and Russia were the big guys. They had the weapons, they had the power, and these advances in space technology started to add fuel to this whole growing hostility. Now, eventually, they got to the point where they began to partner together on some of their endeavors, and it helped to break down some of that tension. But at the start, it definitely was an increase in tension. So prior to this time, we didn't have NASA. NASA was not in existence. Our government, in response to seeing all the stuff that Russia was doing, created NASA in October of 1958. We wanted to beat the Russia in the Cold War game type thing. Remember, the Cold War from your history stuff was not an actual war. We weren't shooting and killing each other. It was just this tension and secrecy and concern that was going on, and a lack of communication going on between the two. So we had the starting of NASA. During the time that we were still developing our program, Russia just kept right on going, and they launched a spacecraft in 1959 that completed the first flyby of the moon, taking a look at what does it look like, how does this work. And it continued on past the moon, and it went into orbit around the sun as well. Then in September of '59, they launched Luna 2. This spacecraft was launched carrying the Soviet coat of arms, and it crash-landed onto the surface of the moon. On April 12th in 1961, Russia launched Vostok 1, and that was carrying the first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, and I'm probably not saying his name correctly, but he was the first man in space and successfully entered space and orbited Earth. So again, really getting the United States going, man, come on, we got to do something about this. Well, President Kennedy was in office at the time, and he spoke to the nation at that time, and he just expressed that we were embarrassed that Russia had superior technology. He didn't feel like that was right. We should be in the lead. And he made a commitment at that point, and he said, we will put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And so that put the challenge out there, and that put the pressure on NASA to get going. So he did a special address to Congress on the importance of space on May 25th, 1961. If you'd like to listen to it, you can listen to it on homeofheroes.com at this link here. Feel free to do that. It's a great speech. And so we got our first American into space on February 20th, 1962, and this was astronaut John Glenn. He orbited the Earth 3 times and then safely returned back to Earth again. So in July of 1934, the United States launched Ranger 7, which crash-landed on the lunar surface, but it did return the first close-up images of the moon. And then the Russians made another huge step, though, in their progress. In 1965, they did the first spacewalk, and so they had sent up their cosmonaut, Alexei Leonov, And without telling anybody he was going to do this, they had him get out of the spacecraft and float around out there. And he was out there for about 10 to 12 minutes. But while he was out there, his spacesuit inflated in the vacuum of space. And that's a normal thing to happen, but of course they hadn't really thought that through, and so he wasn't finding he was able to fit back through the airlock back into the vessel. And so once the television coverage had ended for it, thankfully nobody was watching because he was pretty panic-stricken, but he had to bleed off some of the oxygen in order to get back in to the craft, and that was very dangerous because that's the oxygen he needed to breathe. So it was a very scary situation. His parents, thankfully, were not having to watch him go through that. They were already pretty stressed out when he got out of the craft because they didn't know he was going to do that either. So it was pretty tense, but their troubles were not over because when they went to re-enter Earth, they lost a part of their control system, and they ended up doing an emergency landing in Siberia, 2,000 miles off course. They ended up landing in a whole bunch of snow, and they were stuck there because they took a while before people could come and get them. So, but they survived. Meanwhile, in 1965, the United States was able to send a craft off to Mars and return some close-up images of the planet and complete a flyby of the planet, so we got a lot of good information there. At the same time, Russia was headed over to Venus, and their first craft that they sent over, Venera 3, crashed on the surface of Venus, but then 2 years later they sent Venera 4, and it was able to slowly descend through the atmosphere and return the first images of the planet itself. So both of the countries were getting closer to the moon. Russia in 1966 did a soft landing of a craft onto the surface of the moon, so they would be able to very gently set something down, which of course you got to be able to do if you're going to have people involved. Meanwhile, the United States had a setback, and I'm going to play you the news recording for what happened with our situation here.
Astronauts Roger Chaffee, Edward White, and Gus Grissom lose their lives in a tragic flash fire aboard their grounded space capsule. The tragedy occurred during a simulated countdown for the first flight of the Apollo program, whose goal is to put a man on the moon by 1970. Grissom and White were veterans of spaceflight. Chaffee, a rookie. During a drill similar to this, the entire three-man crew was engulfed by flames. A blue-ribbon panel of space experts is investigating, aided by impounded NASA films and tape recording. Grissom was one of the 7 original astronauts. White was America's first spacewalker. Chaffee, never in space, had long experience as a jet test pilot. He was proud and happy that his first flight was to initiate the Apollo program. When the tragedy struck, one of the astronauts shouted, "Fire in the spacecraft!" In a few seconds, all 3 were victims of the swift inferno which left the capsule a blackened shell. One reporter said it looked like the inside of a furnace. Investigators theorize that perhaps a short circuit or electrical overload may have sparked the blaze. 27 would-be rescuers were all overcome by smoke and heat. Astronauts Chaffee, White, and Grissom, martyred heroes who gave their lives in total dedication to duty. Their memory will forever be honored.
So then Russia went on in 1968 to launch Zond 5. This was Russian unmanned craft that orbits the moon, and it returned to Earth again. So everybody was getting close. Everything was ramping up in tension and intensity. And here we are, we're getting close to that end of that time frame that Kennedy referred to, saying we're going to put a man on the moon before 1970. So the United States was still committed to that goal, and on December 25th of 1968, Apollo 8 became the first manned spacecraft to orbit the moon. So they went all the way around it. It was the second manned mission of the Apollo program, in which Frank Borman James Lovell and William Anders became the first humans to leave the Earth, and they went around the moon. While in orbit, they did a Christmas Eve television broadcast, and they read from the book of Genesis on that, and it's one of the most watched broadcasts to date, and so I've put the link here for you if you would like to see that. Apollo 11 then launched on July 16th of 1969. It had the intent of successfully landing on the moon, and that was with Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Ed Buzz Aldrin. And of course they were successful on that. So on July 20th of 1969, Neil Armstrong made his famous quote, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." In 1971, we had Salyut 1. That was the first space station. That was a Russian space station. And the Skylab space station was the first U.S. space station, and it launched on March of 1973. It did crash in Australia in July of 79. The Apollo program continued. They continued to send out missions, and they sent out a total of 8 missions to the moon. Apollo 13, you may be familiar with because of the movie that was made on it, and from the accounts of the living astronauts, they had said it was very accurate with the exception of the language. They said that no astronaut would be swearing, and they are swearing in the movie, so just kind of an interesting side note there. In July of 75, Apollo 18 docked with a Russian space station, so you can see we were coming around out of that Cold War thing into being more of a partnership and learning about space together. So when will we return to the moon? Well, there are thoughts in mind with NASA that it could be a good launching place for getting to other planets, and so we may someday have a station on the moon, but that's not for certain. So moving forward, in 1976 we had the Viking explorers, and I just put a quote on here from NASA. The Viking Mars mission was performed by 2 spacecraft. You had Viking 1 and Viking 2, and they launched within a couple weeks of each other, and they were going to study Mars even more. They took pictures of the surface, and then they had landers on them that separated from the orbiters, and they soft landed on the planet and then continued to take pictures from the planet's surface. Then we had Voyager 1 and 2 in 1977, and these were launched by NASA in separate months from Cape Canaveral in Florida. They were supposed to do close-up studies of Jupiter and Saturn, Saturn's rings, and the larger moons of the 2 planets, but between the 2 of them, they ended up exploring all of the giant outer planets of the solar system, 48 of their moons, and the unique system of rings and magnetic fields of those planets as well. So they accomplished a lot, sending back a ton of information. And then in the 80s, we started the Space Shuttle program, and this was the first time that we had a reusable space shuttle. So it didn't have to be, abandoned, or it wasn't destroyed on re-entry and that sort of thing. So it was used more than once. It expanded the limits of our achievement, and of course it was able to allow our astronauts to get out and do a lot of exploring. So you can see that they flew over 130 times, carrying over 350 people into space and traveling more than 500 million miles. So lots and lots of progress made with the space shuttles. Then in 1986 we had another setback. We had an explosion, and this was supposed to be the first time that a civilian was going to be going up. We had a teacher that was chosen to be part of the mission, and shortly after liftoff there was a malfunction, and all of the crew members were killed. Very, very sad situation. I was actually in high school about your age when this happened, and I remember it taking place. So where are we going to go from here? Well, our eyes seem to be fixed on Mars. We'd really like to be able to put a person on Mars. We've had satellites going around it. We've had these 2 wonderful rovers that have been on the surface and traveling about, taking samples, running tests and such, but we want to put a person there. Problem is, it would still take many years to get there and many years to get back, and so right now it's just a one-way ticket kind of thing, but we still have people who are willing to do that. So it remains to be seen which direction we'll go, but right now the plan is to head to Mars. So we'll talk more about space travel as we go through the course, but this kind of brings us up to present day.